Okay, I think we might kick off this afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us on this Friday afternoon. Thank you for your commitment. We recognise it's been a huge few days. I just wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet, on this unceded land, and thank them for their stewardship of the water, the lands and the spirit around us. I'm Erin Anderson. I'm Technical Director of Asia Pacific for Cowater International, and I'm your chair this afternoon. We're very excited to be meeting for this Panel 5C on mobilising private finance for agriculture, infrastructure and climate. We'll be using microphones this afternoon as we've got some members joining us online. I ask at the end when we do Q&A, please make sure you put your hand up and the mic will come to you. And with that, I'll introduce our first panellist, who'll be talking about financing the future of food in Nepal, and that is Safa. Safa is a researcher at the International Water Management Institute in Nepal. She is a National Geographic explorer as well, just because that keeps her busy, you know, and an honorary lecturer at the Crawford School of Public Policy at ANU. Thank you, Safa.
Hello, good morning. It's morning out here, actually, 6:20 a.m. So it's still early for me in the day. I hope the presentation, and since it's afternoon for you guys, I hope it's exciting enough to stay awake. The title seems fancy, right? It is the Financing the Future of Food. So one of the things is that the idea of financing the future of food in Nepal started out as a exploratory study to see what is the challenge in revenue, not only revenue, but also to access finance so that it can improve agriculture. And so a little bit about IMI. IMI is an international organization with offices in more than 15 countries, works on water security, and is to provide innovative partnerships, collective solutions for resilient water systems for the world. Focus also a lot on Asia, Central Asia, Latin America, and the Pacific a little bit. Okay, the context of this presentation. It started out as a scoping study. It was built with a lot of partners on the ground, a lot of them from the private sector, from cooperatives, from microfinance, insurance institutions. So it was a very collective exploratory study. And a little bit about agriculture and finance in Nepal. Agriculture is in Nepal majorly based on small landholding, and most of the practices around subsistence. And if it's these small farmers, also if they have selling, it's like just small selling to markets. And because of that, there is a shortage on foods in Nepal. So there is growing, increasing agriculture imports, which has reached 3.3 billion, which is over 5% of the GDP of Nepal. So Nepal also wants to be more food secure. It's one of the country's ambition. But food security and rural livelihoods are under growing pressure due to water scarcity, increasing climate variability, because Nepal is this mountainous country. It has valleys, and climate change is impacting it a lot lately. And because of the uncertainties in farming systems, there is increasing migration. And because of migration, there are labor shortages, and also the land holdings are fragmented. So small parcels of land, small patches of food that can be cultivated. When we talk about agricultural financial landscape, that was what we were assessing. It is a wide spectrum. It ranges all the way from loans, credits that banks provide, subsidies that the government provides, grants also that the government provides, insurance schemes, private equity, which is like private lending for businesses. There's community-based lending, which is from cooperatives, which is smaller amounts. Then there's climate finance for adaptation, which is like these, again, similar to grant, subsidies, it's a mix. And then there's also remittances, because a lot of Nepali diaspora, which has migrated away from the villages, is sending money back to their families, which is becoming a source of finance for farmers as well. But there's a lot of, because of all, there's a whole spectrum of finance that can be accessed by farmers. But in the last census, which was 2021, they found that the number of landholdings that received loans decreased to only 12%, despite also the national and federal bank making it mandate that every bank should provide 15% of their loans for the agriculture sector. So a lot of banks, so this mandate makes it's a mandatory thing that they need to do, and if they don't do it, they have to pay a fine. But a lot of banks it's easier sometimes to pay the fine because there's either not enough people taking the loans, or it's a very high-risk venture for banks. There's also innovation gaps in the farming sector. There are technologies, there's solar irrigation, precision farming, drip irrigation, multiple different types of new forms of agriculture innovations, but their uptake is low because there is knowledge gap, support, because you want to try something new, you need extension support. You want to, like any of us, when you want to try something new, you call someone, you check on it, you test it. This is similar for farmers. Testing new technology is it's an expensive venture because you have to invest in it. And then there's also financing barriers. Despite there being all of these different landscape, it's sometimes still a barrier for people in remote regions to access loans or subsidies or any of these financial landscape available. And then there's also systemic issues. There's policy gaps, high collateral requirements from sometimes it's not even high, but just the collateral requirement makes it very difficult for farmers. Some of them who don't have land, they lease land. The regulation systems is weak. There's risk management is difficult to check because a lot of places are far remote, difficult to access, takes days to reach. And then there is limited de-risking opportunities. There's insurance is 1% of farmers in Nepal have insurance. So there's a need to assess what are the de-risking ventures, because you can't just be like, okay, let's make it easy to access finance. You make it easy to access finance, but without de-risking opportunities, it becomes an additional burden for farmers because they have to pay back on these loans. And if there is climate change, suddenly there is a flood and your whole crop is gone. How do you repay back the loans that you're getting? So what we started out is trying to look at it through a systemic process and looking at it holistically. So what it needs is an innovative partnership, co-creation to reduce risk, increase productivity for farmers, and promote rural economic inclusion and food security for Nepal. The process of the scoping study that we did is, like we had been speaking, AMI institutionally has been working with farmers for a very long time. We have a lot of farmer side experiences, but we were like, what about the finance side? What about the side of the financial institutions that are available in Nepal? What are they saying about this situation? So far, it's 4 or 5 months been since we started this. So far, we've spoken to 26 participants from more than 15 institutions. This includes commercial banks, microfinance institutions, specialized agencies, a whole range. We did semi-structured interviews, we did roundtables, and also found that these institutions collectively oversee more than $1 billion in finance and investment in Nepal. So 15 institutions, like research-wise, you're like only 15, but these 15 have more than $1 billion of finance and investment that they're capable of providing. What we found from the initial policy insights, from the initial scoping study, we've seen through the policy and regulation, there are multiple policies, but each of these policies have their own gaps. There is the agriculture development strategy. It is it's an initiative of the government of Nepal. It's to, as I mentioned, to reduce the dependency on agriculture food imports. But it is also tricky to implement. The federal bank, which is the Nepal Rashtra Bank, again, mandated 15% agriculture lending. There are loans, there are subsidies. There's a lot of money out there, but many banks are not able to fill that 15%. They are trying to work their way up to it. Banks are, from conversations, they're like, we're working to it right now. We're like 10, 13, 14%. And hopefully by 27, they will be on at 15%. But what they also find is the lending is becoming for different reasons. It sometimes will be like buy a tractor, or it can be like, sometimes also it can be non-agriculture, like quasi-agriculture related issues, things for which agricultural loans are being given. There's also green finance initiatives, climate finance policies. But these policies also are new, and so understanding them and implementing them is still complicated. A lot of the banks itself are like, they're like, the whole process is tricky to get through. There are climate bonds, but what does that mean when we are lending to farmers? There's also master plans, there's agribusiness promotion plans, and there are still, it's a very new area, so the uptake is still very marginal. People don't know what it'll look like. It's a risky venture. Then the institutional support is also, because Nepal has such a diverse terrain, there is different types of institutions that are providing pockets of innovation. So there is stuff happening. It is technical assistance is there, capacity building is there, but it is like pilot projects that are happening in different places. Concerted, systematic, overall across Nepal, it is still very rudimentary. So within, for farmers, what we found is in this process, for them, there's water scarcity, there's increasing climate variability. There's also imports from India that make it less competitive for them to grow food because it's cheaper when it comes across from India. The price of vegetables are cheaper, so it's not competitive enough sometimes for them to sell their goods in the market. There's also a decline in the cultivated area, which is in Nepal. Nationally, it's declined by 12% from 2011. In the hilly regions, the decline is 22%, because in the hilly regions, agriculture is difficult. It is labor intensive. And when a lot of the male migrate, it's the women who are doing agriculture. So it's a labor intensive process, labor shortages, etc. There's also growing, as I said, the growing out migration is also leading to abandoned farmlands. This is another reason is that there is limited support, market access to be able to sell your goods in a fair price, technical know-how to uptake new technologies, which can ease the labor load in the hilly regions, but there's limited information about this. Or if you want to buy drip irrigation, where do you get it from? It's a little bit of expensive. There is also timely and quality products, like your fertilizer, your seeds of quality will make a lot of difference. But that timely input when you want to farm, when the season is right, if you don't get your correct seeds when the season is right, then it becomes difficult. It delays things, and it also causes a lot of problems. There's also a politicization. As I mentioned, technology can reduce risk, but our adoption rate is low. And then from the private sector also, when we spoke to them, what we found is that they said agriculture has the highest default rates in repayments of loans. But it's a spectrum. What they found also is a lot of small landholders, their repayment rate is actually very high. And as you go to larger farmers, the default rates are higher. The small and fragmented landholding size, remote locations, increase transaction costs for the banks, for the insurance institutions to be able to verify, and then also for the farmers to provide collateral. It's a whole process to get to a bank. And again, when banks want to invest, as you go to high agribusinesses, the bankability, investment-ready ventures are also limited because there is this gap in what does a bankable project mean. Also, the agriculture supply chain, which is like from the farm to processing to wholesale markets to your supermarket. this supply chain, also before that, from the seeds, the chemical fertilizers, the agri-tech that should be available. This whole supply chain is not fully developed in many places. And so investments may not yield adequate results because you can create an amazing crop, but if you delay in getting it to the market, your crop decays, and you lost value on it. Policy uncertainty is also there. The subsidies, grants create behavioral dependency and disincentivize farmers from taking loans. So sometimes they'd rather wait for the potential of getting a subsidy or a grant than take loans and finance. And also this subsidy and grants from the government, it keeps changing, policies changing, because the government also wants to try and make things better, but it creates this finicky, uncertain environment. Insurance companies, which is a great de-risking opportunity for farmers, face high operational cost, and then also farmers don't trust it very much because the repayment when they face climate uncertainty, or if there's a flood, there's a drought, the repayment from the insurance companies takes a long time. So the farmers lose trust in these insurance companies, and even with government subsidies. So these are all the limitations that the private sector faces as they're implementing this. But there's also opportunities. One of the things we had asked a lot of the private sector is, what do you think are the opportunities? They're there are many opportunities because there's so much scope to do new things. Innovative financing models, such as based on the farmer type, based for small farmers, a different type of loan product, based on the crops that they're doing, reframe loan products, shift the timing of when they have to start, as loan products for suppose your student loans, or when you look at big companies that are creating new loans. They get a delay in when they start payments. But farmer loans are still structured according to old systems. So how do we rethink the structure of the loans for farmers, create pooled resources, tie it to the market to increase farmer access and reduce lender risk? How do we think of streamlining the policies? Currently, there are all of these diverse policies and directives and subsidies, and there is option to de-risk new technology. And these blended finance, which is where the government provides a pocket of money for private sector, so that if there is a default, this public finance can supplement it. So it's this creating this blended structure to de-risk investments for the banks. But then for the farmer side, de-risking also could mean by agriculture insurance. De-risking could also mean providing partnerships for support, technical know-how, increasing access to better quality products, increasing reliable fair trade market access. Because you don't want to provide excessive finance to farmers and create a debt trap if the farming system fails. So how do you create a balanced system where you're not increasing access to finance without de-risking opportunities? Also, in the digital revolution provides a lot of AI provides a lot of new scope to be able to reach remote farmers digitally, because you can oversee, you can also provide service via phone. There is connectivity. There are apps for farmers in Nepal where they can get information about the weather, information about when to water, what kind of crops, based on soils that they have. So all of this information is available. The reach is still limited. How do we improve that reach? But also new forms of insurance that are digitally reducing the transaction cost of overseas monitoring. From Australia, while we might think these things are given, right? Everyone has your own phone, you access everything easily. It is still, the reach and the spread is still nascent in Nepal. Some of the key takeaways, and I'm closing the presentation now, is that while the Nepal agriculture sector faces major financial challenges, and there is low access to, and I say access, not availability. There is a lot of finance that is available, but the access for small-scale farmers is low due to their remoteness, the high costs that they have to face in accessing a loan. And then also from the investor side, there is the risk in farming sector. So how do we reduce the risk for the farmers? How do we make the banks more, which if you reduce the risk for the farmers, it makes the banks more sure to give loans to them. So de-risking and inclusive financial solutions tailored to these diverse needs of farmers, and bridging the policy gaps and ambiguity of the policy gaps is another key thing that has to happen. There are growing policies, but its translation to action is missing. And this is a persistent challenge. Agriculture, declining interest in agriculture is a persistent challenge across Nepal. It's also globally a phenomenon that is being observed. There is also out-migration, limited market access. So there are these persistent challenges that require systemic action, and across the whole value chain. We can't just solve the financing problem and be like, we're done. But then because there is so many challenges, there are also so many opportunities and innovations that are growing, and there's a lot of pockets of amazing innovations that are happening in Nepal that provide hope for that change that is required. But these actions require consistent, ongoing effort and ongoing commitment from diverse actors, right from the public, private, farmers, cooperatives, all across the value chain, traders, aggregators, processors, the government. It requires consistent and connected action across all of these different actors. And that is my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Safa. So next we have Garron and Ratri, and they're going to be talking about climate finance catalysing inclusive development. And Ratri first is Executive Director at Pollination. Ratri has worked across Asia Pacific and Europe in corporate finance and sustainable infrastructure, helping drive investment in renewable energy and real estate. And Garron is a Senior Vice President for Growth at Chemonics. Garron has 2 decades in international development, leading initiatives to close climate finance gaps and expand agriculture and food security programs worldwide. Over to you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So just a very brief introduction, if we can go to the next slide, please. Next one. So my name's Ratri Wakeling. I'm an executive director in Pollination. We are a global advisory and investment firm that focuses in climate and nature. We've only been around for almost 7 years, but most of our teams have been working in climate and nature and renewables and decarbonization most of our career. Our mission is quite simple, but very always challenging to achieve. So we advise, incubate and invest scalable climate and nature solutions, turning them into bankable projects and assets that will eventually attract institutional capital and support its scale and impact. And sort of as reflected by our partnerships, we have a number of strategic partnerships with institutional investors, including HSBC, where we are partnering with them in a venture called Climate Asset Management that invests in natural capital and carbon projects globally, as well as partnerships with a couple of large corporate banks, Mizuho in Japan and ANZ in Australia. So I wanted to share a little bit about a part of Pollination where I spend most of my time in. We're called Pollination, Carbon and Nature. team. We are a project developer within Pollination, where we aim to develop 10 large-scale, high-integrity, nature-based solutions projects that will eventually cumulatively remove or reduce 500 million tons of CO2 from our projects by 2050. Our projects are all in the targeting in the nature-based solutions space, particularly afforestation, reforestation and revegetation, mangrove and peatland restoration, as well as supporting projects such as sustainable agriculture, rice methane reduction, and biochar as well. We work and incubate and develop and invest in these NBS projects that ensures that it's scalable, works alongside and brings benefits beyond carbon to community, biodiversity, and climate as well. We, from a commercialization pathway perspective, we leverage the existing infrastructure of carbon markets, whether that's compliance and involving Article 6, as well as voluntary carbon markets, as well as looking at opportunities in the emerging nature and biodiversity market side. Our aim really is to channel climate finance to projects with meaningful pathways to scale, and again, bring that impactful outcomes and economic benefits to communities and biodiversity. Next slide, please. So I think from a sort of a private finance perspective, we know inherently that we just cannot finance all these projects by ourselves. We currently have 3 operating projects in Pakistan and Timor-Leste as well, and a growing portfolio of projects in Southeast Asia, particularly in Indonesia and in Bangladesh and the Philippines as well. So we can't finance these projects by ourselves. Inherently, as Safa was mentioning earlier as well, there's always a very large risk gap between project design, so the early stages of project design, and issuance timing when a project starts generating income. And this gap can be a lot more sort of variable and unpredictable compared to much more mature asset classes and projects like renewable energy and sustainable infrastructures. So the way that we work is we always partner with other capital solutions providers. That spans across other NGOs, institutional capital, and also the corporate side of the world as well. So one of the partnerships that we have in place and we're very happy about is our MOU with Indonesia Investment Authority, one of the 2 sovereign wealth funds in Indonesia that has the objective and the mandate to co-invest with international investors, particularly looking to originate and invest in nature-based solutions projects in Indonesia. Next slide. Yep. So maybe just to share a little bit as well about how our projects are designed. So the projects that we incubate and we develop are really anchored in integrating community and biodiversity outcomes into its design from very early stages. Because as we know, the longevity and the success of the projects over a long period of time can only be achieved with community support as well. So beyond revenue sharing, we're exploring a number of partnership models, including down on the right-hand side there, equity partnerships with community and landholders as well to develop large-scale projects, whether it's on the decarbonization side as well as the natural-based solutions side of things. Next slide, please. So I might just take through a couple of case studies of projects that we have done to date. So on the right-hand side is the Aboriginal Clean Energy Partnership that our energy decarbonization team is originating and developing in the East Kimberley region, where we're partnering with the traditional owner groups to develop renewable energy projects and a green hydrogen project through an equity partnership model. On the left-hand side, we've got our Raimatak project, which is a community-based agroforestry project in Timor-Leste. Working with our in-country partners, we have been working on the project, I think, for several years already, and we're looking to scale this up to a national level project, which is already now registered under gold standard. Next slide. And again, a little bit more about our Raimatak project. So it's been operating for over 10 years in country, particularly working and enrolling with 2,600 smallholder farmers. We have an MOU with the government to support the national level scale-up of the project, and we have an ambition to roll this out across 20,000, to enroll 20,000 farmers as well across the nation. Again, an example of using climate finance, particularly carbon markets, to channel into these restoration projects. And finally, the next slide, please. Thanks. And our other operating project as well is the Delta Blue Carbon. So this is one of the largest blue carbon projects globally, located in the Sindh province near the Indus Delta River, where we are hoping to restore over 400,000 hectares of degraded mangrove areas, and have completed about 25% of that in a very long 10 years. And we've now issued 5 million tons of carbon credits under the VM33 methodology of Vera, and have received the CCB standard and the gold level as well. And then the next slide, again, just on the just sharing a little bit as well about the format and the structure of the program. The capital partnership is really hopefully translated very well here, where we do partner with, under public-private partnership, we partner with the government of Sindh, who are the landholders, and we sort of catalyze all the relationships on the commercial side as well. So we've invested the early seed capital to grow the project and to pilot the project. And then we also commercialize the sale of the carbon credits through a number of buyers. Our buyers includes the likes of Microsoft and others, and we also work together with a number of technical partners in country and internationally as well. So that's a little bit about pollination, carbon, and nature, and our projects.
Thank you, Ratri. We decided to share our time at this conference today because Chemonics and Pollination partnered on a globally funded project by USAID that I'll talk a little bit about. And I think it shows an example of how Chemonics tries to get the best technical expertise to solve the right problem at the right time, and that's kind of part of our partnership methodology that I'll explain a little bit. So I know not everyone here may be familiar with Chemonics. We're a US-based company that has been operating since 1975, so this is our 50th anniversary year, and now we have offices in Washington, London, Dubai, France, Germany, Manila, and our newest office is here in Canberra, so very global presence, and we currently have 2,500 employees across the world and 80 project offices, so very diversified, disparate staff. We've worked in a lot of technical sectors globally, as you can see up there on the screen. We were USAID's largest implementing partner and are still the Department of State's largest implementer for humanitarian assistance work. We implement the famine early warning system, a global kind of early warning system on food security that's used by pretty much every international organization working on food security and hunger. We also implement a large pharmaceutical supply program across the world on behalf of the US government. Next slide, please. So this is a slide just showing a little bit more detail on where we've worked in climate or climate finance. And I will give the caveat that the colors are reversed. So something I will admit is I am colorblind. So when I was making this slide, I got green and blue mixed up. So flip those in your mind, and then the slide will be accurate. But as you can see, we've worked in climate finance specifically in many, many countries. And that was largely through a large USAID-funded program that I will mention. But the suite of things that we did here, it's everything from advising governments directly in some of those countries in green on things like climate policy or anti-pollution for plastics, all the way to designing financial instruments with the private sector directly. If you go to the next one. Yeah. So this project I've mentioned is called the Sustainable Investment Accelerator. It was a $250 million USAID funded, intended to be 8 years, but only ended up running for 3 with some of the disruption on the US government side of things. And its primary goal was to mobilize $2.5 billion of private capital for climate finance. So very ambitious goal, high leverage ratio. And it was structured in a way where the different USAID missions or posts in the kind of the DFAT terminology could buy into the technical services that were centrally located in Washington and then advise missions to carry out their climate goals or the goals that they felt were most important for the countries in which they worked. And so it was set up to really involve local partners at every stage. So we set up something called the Climate Finance Investment Network, which was a range of over 2,000 local civil society, first-time female fund managers, any kind of entity that was interested in mobilizing climate finance and procuring through that network as much of the work as we possibly could, along with our 5 implementation partners, Pollination being one of those, kind of sitting on the central technical level. And it really had the mandate to do anything that was necessary. Could advise on policy, could advise private sector, could help develop bankable projects, and over those 3 years really did quite a wide range of activities, some of which Ratri has discussed in her presentation. But I think I will go give a couple other examples that just kind of set this kind of global context for what we were trying to do. Yeah, so something I think relevant to the Pacific, we had a very large project under SIA that was called the Caribbean Climate Investment Program, and it was designed to cover many different island states. You can see them over there on the right column, with the idea that there wasn't maybe enough current private sector investors in any of those individual countries, so working across those nations with some of the regional development banks on standing up a facility that could drive climate finance across all of those countries. If you want to go to the next one. Yeah, and so what did that look like in practice? I think, we had the challenge of taking very lofty goals and creating a very pragmatic design that could get done in a short period of time. And so there were really 3 main components of SIA and what we offered missions and then by extension governments and investors. And it was a set of grants that were really focused on innovative technologies or adaptation practices, and those should have been locally driven solutions that would receive those grants. We had an on-demand technical assistance facility, which served both governments on policy analysis. I think there was a lot of climate modeling, a lot of national strategy development, a lot of policy analysis. As I think Safa mentioned, a lot of these policies are new, and there was a lot of questions on, how should governments really decide what policies to enact and then how to measure their effectiveness. And then finally, a project preparation facility, which was designed to give businesses technical advice to make their projects more bankable or figure out what instruments those projects could benefit from, financial instruments on the climate finance side. And then we would take those directly to the investor network that we had developed as part of our project. So what that looked like in practice was really an incredible diversity of different mini projects underneath this large global project. And so I just selected a few examples here to give you that pragmatic, on the ground, what results did we see in those initial years. In addition to mobilizing almost $1 billion of climate finance in that first 3 years, we did these are some businesses that we supported or organizations that we supported. So across the Caribbean, we worked with Blue Circle Energy to introduce new battery energy storage systems across Barbados, which was meant to supplement the national grid there. We worked with Solar Axiom in the Dominican Republic to find different financing mechanisms for clean energy projects. We worked with EarthSpark in Haiti, which was really meant to scale up the solar photovoltaic microgrid model, really looking to expand electricity to communities that didn't have them before. And then we worked with an organization in Trinidad and Tobago called Ecosystem Approach, working on sustainable mangrove oyster harvesting projects there. So these are really just a couple examples of many, many more that I could give, but wanted to show how not only here in Asia Pacific, but globally, we kind of took this lofty idea that USAID had and kind of created a very pragmatic approach to drive results. So maybe next slide, yeah. And so maybe I'll start here and then see if Ratri has any key takeaways she wants to supplement with. But I think for all of the many, many lessons learned, that bottom one on the right is, for me, what was the most really interesting learning is there's a lot that we can do. There's a lot that's very technically complicated in terms of climate finance. But what really, I think, came up over and over is you have to choose the right instrument for the right project, and it's often simpler than you think it would be. And so a lot of instruments that may not have been considered climate finance 10 years ago when this wasn't such a term, but have existed, such as insurance, parametric flood insurance, agriculture insurance, really can unlock a lot of dollars. So start simple and move from there. Maybe I'll pass it to you and
just following on what Garron has mentioned again. I think from our side of things, certainly we would always love to invite more private and blended finance actors to participate with us to quickly scale up these urgent climate and decarbonization projects, particularly in places where budgets are certainly constrained. And I think from our learning as well is that to involve commercial finance providers and institutional capital, you need to really anchor in the commerciality of the projects as well. And again, echoing on what Garron was saying, starting simple and using instruments that we are familiar with is always a good start rather than waiting for the perfect instrument. Environmental markets and carbon markets have had its fair share of criticism and things like that, but ultimately it is a form of climate finance to flow into projects that really, really need it most as well. And so a better understanding of these types of asset classes, natural capital asset classes by institutional investors would be great to have over time. And obviously as well, overlaying not just sort of the carbon benefits, but also outcomes to community and biodiversity as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ratri and Garron. That was fantastic. I want to learn more about pollination and some of the things you're doing. I think it's great to see so much innovation in this space. It is, as you both reflected, there's a lot of possibility, but it's also quite a complex space, and getting the right instruments is critical. So next we're going to hear from Justin Larson. Justin is a Senior Manager for Climate and Energy Programs with RTI International. He holds a PhD in economics and has over a decade of experience in energy development across Africa, Asia and the Pacific. Justin has led initiatives to expand private sector participation in off-grid energy and developed innovative models for healthcare electrification. His recent work focuses on energy and private investment in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, and he's also, I hear, a pretty hot trivia whiz in his free time.
Go Ben's team. All right. Thank you. So first, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. I would also like to pay my respects to the elders, past and present. So I'm going to do a quick poll. Who likes ice cream? Okay, so your hands do work. And there's a connection to North Carolina, where RTI is based, to Canberra and ice cream, so come talk to me after. Any econometricians, applied economists in the room? Don't ask me questions. Any early career researchers, grad students? Awesome, come talk to me after. All right. So before I dive in, I just want to give a little bit of context. Why is private sector participation important? We just saw ODA globally get decimated. And that's how we get to do the awesome, impactful work that we have the privilege of doing. And private sector is just another resource that we can leverage to maximize that impact. It can be a multiplier, it can increase economic and diplomatic ties, it can promote self-reliance and tangible long-term development on the ground, if done right. So I really want to start from that point that there is a role for private sector to play. There's different ways we can measure it. And ODA is the initial leverage that we have for crowding in that private sector participation. Next slide, please. So to start, this is just a first pass analysis. I think my abstract was probably a little overly ambitious for the bandwidth I had. So grad student, please come talk to me after. I need some help. And this is really designed, my biggest hope by the end of the presentation is that you see that there is a there. There's evidence of ODA crowding in private sector participation. So I'm an academic and an implementer. You gotta bear with me. I'm gonna go through research questions, hypotheses, but I'm gonna try to go through fairly quickly. So research question 1, is ODA associated with private sector participation in partner countries? And I'm focused only on DFAT ODA spend. 2, through which channels and under which conditions do those effects emerge? And I don't quite get to this in this study, so we'll talk about next steps, but there's a nice quasi-natural experiment in the reduction of ODA spend in Indonesia in 2014. So hypothesis, ODA does increase foreign direct investment inflows in recipient countries. ODA also increases bilateral trade with Australia. It'd be a little bad if that wasn't the case, considering. And effects are stronger where governance and financial depth are higher. And once again, the Indonesia case. Next slide, please. So what does the literature say? And I'm waving hands a little bit here. I don't want to get swamped on who said what, but these are the high levels from the literature. ODA can crowd in foreign direct investment and trade by improving infrastructure, human capital, institutions, but can also crowd it out, particularly if that ODA spend becomes a substitute for what government or public institutions should be, if it becomes a long-standing part of that public structure, if it provides perverse incentives. And for foreign direct investment, though, across the literature, it's kind of a mixed bag. Where it is present, it can be weak or highly conditional. It's not a clear relationship in the prior literature. On trade, and I don't quite get to this in this analysis, but there's a little bit of a conversation we have on it. There's an interesting effect called the Vanguard effect, and the Japanese are the prime example for it, so via JICA. The idea being that ODA spend from Japan also brings along private sector participation in trade from Japanese firms. Next slide. So the conceptual framework. ODA can affect foreign direct investment by improving governance and regulatory quality, project preparation and pipeline development, which we heard from our colleagues earlier, risk sharing, blended finance instruments, information and signaling to investors, so that Vanguard effect again. The government says we're going to commit $50 million to Papua New Guinea to do something. That's a signal that there's an interest for more bilateral flows. Right, in a very simple graph here, and this will come up again later, there's potentially a quadratic relationship between ODA spend and foreign direct investment. So if you think about how ODA potentially crowds in foreign direct investment through that improving governance, improving infrastructure, creating those conditions that private sector wants to come and participate, there's potentially then some peak, right? So if those institutions start to become too reliant on ODA, they become inefficient, they become, try not to be super cynical, but they don't act on their own. And it starts to crowd out and also create a potential for corruption. So crowding out that private sector participation. All right, so next slide. So put together a panel. Like I said, I'm an academic, econometrician when it's convenient. And starting with DFAT ODA spend, World Bank Foreign Direct Investment data, and Transparency International's Corruption Perceptions Index. So the idea here is not trying to shove everything into a single regression. I should be able to explain a relationship fairly easily, 3 variables. That Corruption Perceptions Index is a proxy here for how private sector might view that environment in a given country. Right, so unit of observation, country year, window of observation 2012 to 2024. And of the countries that had available complete data to make a nice balanced panel, you can see through the list there. And the ones that I'll pick on, next slide, you're good. The ones I'll pick on are PNG, Papua New Guinea, and the Philippines. Right, so this is just pooled OLS. We don't need to go down the rabbit hole of what that means. It's the most basic regression you can do with a panel. And the stars there mean statistically significant, so likely not zero. And ODA and ODA squared, so this is that quadratic relationship. If we look at, let's see, column 2 and column 4, you'll see, let's start with column 2, a positive coefficient on the ODA, negative coefficient on ODA squared. So what does that mean? If we have a small number for ODA, you're going to have a positive impact on foreign direct investment. As that number gets larger, that quadratic term gets larger because it's squared, and eventually it's going to flip the relationship with foreign direct investment. So this means we're starting to see a little bit of evidence. There's a there's some smoke that signals there might be a fire, showing that there is this crowding in and crowding out effect of foreign direct investment from ODA. And then CPI is that Corruption Perceptions Index. So if you look at the bottom right, at least for the full regression, there's a positive relationship. So the index, the higher the number, the lower the perception of corruption. So this is a positive relationship between foreign direct investment and that perception or lack of corruption. All right, next slide. Same exact model specification, but now putting in dummy variables for Indonesia, Philippines, and PNG. 3 very different countries, 3 very different economic structures, 3 very different contexts. And when you control for Indonesia in the whole panel, all those effects go away. And you see this massive positive coefficient for that dummy of Indonesia. So what does it tell us? ODA is probably not doing anything for foreign direct investment in Indonesia. And if it is, it's so small, it's not even detectable. But that there's all of these other things happening that's specific to Indonesia that's drawing in foreign direct investment. It could be momentum. It's a large economy, it's growing, and it's growing quickly. It could be that enabling environment's just better than the other countries in the panel. But it's not from ODA spend. Now, if we look at the Philippines, we see some of those same coefficients come back, right? So still a positive on the dummy for the Philippines, meaning there's something about the Philippines that's drawing foreign direct investment on its own. But then that quadratic relationship between ODA and foreign direct investment is still there. And then if we go to Papua New Guinea, a positive relationship on the non-squared term for ODA, negative on the dummy. Meaning, so there's things about Papua New Guinea's governance structure, economic structures, that's actually a deterrent for foreign direct investment, but ODA is doing something to crowd it in, improving those structures potentially. All right, next slide. Because there's no econometricians in this room, we're not going to bore you too much, but if we take a step back at the individual time series, okay, we talked about the regressions and what those show. What does the time series show? If we just look at these individual countries, can we tease anything out? All right, so you can do a very simple test. It's called a co-integration test. And imagine you're walking a dog. And you, as the dog owner, want to go that way. The dog wants to go that way. And if you weren't attached to the dog by a leash, you would go in your separate directions. That leash is the co-integration. So it means that over time, those two things will move together. They might ebb and flow in which direction, but they're connected. There's something there. So when we do a co-integration test of ODA spend and foreign direct investment for that whole panel, there's only 2 countries that come up, Timor-Leste and the Philippines, which is a little bit surprising. Right? So it's back to this point of there's potentially a linkage between ODA spend and foreign direct investment, highly conditional on the country, and it's not a strong connection. All right, so next slide, please. I kind of gave away my next slide. So ODA does matter for foreign direct investment in recipient countries if economy and capital markets are nascent. So lower income country, more likely a higher impact of ODA and foreign direct investment. Where there is impact, though, it's relatively small. So keep in mind, this is a retrospective study. This isn't saying that ODA spend moving forward is going to behave this way. This is just how ODA spend's been by DFAT and the programming that's happened in the last 12 years. So as ODA supports, and this is back to that relationship we just talked about, as ODA supports economic and institutional development and crowds in private capital, there's potentially some tipping point where ODA will begin to crowd the private capital back out. So next slide. Back to our beautiful mountain here. So in that crowding out region, based off of that regression we looked at earlier, we can think about P&G of maybe being in that bottom left region, right? So there's a pretty strong relationship. ODA is actually doing something to bring in private sector. Then you look at the Philippines, maybe closer to the top. It's maybe about to crest over into that crowding out point. And then Indonesia, I unfairly put at the bottom right, but it's really, could be anywhere on that right-hand side. It's not clear if ODA spend's actually crowding out foreign direct investment, but it's clearly not crowding it in at this point. All right, so next slide. So what does that mean? If we want to bring in more private capital, we want private sector to participate more, then we need to take a look at what ODA spend's actually doing. We can concentrate ODA in complementary inputs. So we talked about government. Our Chemonics colleagues talked about project prep, creating more enabling infrastructure. We can also use ODA spend as a pipeline builder for blended finance, feasibility studies, transaction advisory support, bankable designs. We can target mobilization objectives in high readiness country sector contexts. We can embed private sector participation metrics in MEL. So even at the program level, just incentivizing more private sector participation, right? So this is where I get to tell stories. Some anecdotes from USAID, right? And I think this is something that we just heard from our Chemonics colleagues, and if you talk to other USAID implementers, this was kind of our mantra for a while. And it was because just of how USAID was structured. We leverage profit-seeking behavior to do development work. And that sounds uncomfortable, especially for traditional development practitioners. But when you kind of think about what that means and how it's done, you can do some really good things. So, anecdote. In 2019, I was working on the Power Africa off-grid project, and we had a grant facility. We were trying to figure out what can we do as part of our COVID-19 response. This was an off-grid program. I worked in West, East, and Central Africa, based in South Africa. And with a lot of brainstorming and probably way too much gin with my colleagues, we came up with an idea of let's use the grants to attract private sector to electrify public facilities. We threw out this grant window. USAID loved it. We got 300 applications, which meant a lot of work of review to get it down to 11. And it was pretty earth-shattering for the donor community at that point. I remember getting into fights with World Bank and SC for All because it was just blasphemous in a sense. Why should private sector be involved with public infrastructure? That's the donor's job. That's the government's job. There shouldn't be profit-seeking on something that's a public good. So over those 2 years, we electrified 227 facilities, and those facilities are still operating today. And it's because private sector is there and has an incentive to keep them up and running. It's a revenue source. But if you go back and you look at what was done before from Gavi and from, I should probably stop beating on all these donors. If you look at what was done from all the other donors, we could actually go on site and you could see the failed systems. You could see what UN had donated. You could see what WHO had donated. You could see what Gavi had donated. But because there was no incentive from private sector to stick around and keep the systems up and running, a year and a half, 2 later, they were defunct. And so I still talk with some of those beneficiaries today. USAID's gone. All that support and follow-on support, it's gone. Those systems are still up and running because private sector's there. So that's my evangelizing of private sector, but I really hope that we can try to shift this paradigm and maybe use ODA where there's opportunities of crowding in private sector participation, because there's some real good that can happen. And as that ODA budget shrinks, unfortunately, we have to lean into private sector. All right, continue on. So clear divides, clear divides needed between humanitarian assistance and traditional development work. This is something we've heard from DFAT a little bit this week. I did not put this there because of that. It was a nice coincidence. But what I mean by this is that same point I just mentioned about electrifying health facilities. We have to kind of accept the reality of the world that we operate in. We have declining funds for ODA and humanitarian assistance, and the old model of donating and hoping for the best is not going to work. Incentives matter, and creating perverse incentives are easy to do in a slippery slope. So this is the downside of private sector. So as we start to think about how to restructure ODA spend or how do we restructure this programming, we really need to think about how private sector is going to be involved and what the incentives are for them to stick around. And I more or less gave my last point there, but with the right program design implementation approach, ODA spend can de-risk markets in meaningful ways without direct investment into individual transactions or through de-risking instruments. Next slide. All right, so limitations, and I talked a little bit about this already. I'm completely hand-waving at the heterogeneity of how ODA spend is applied, and it's not considered here, right? So it's just ODA, broadly speaking, across the countries. There's limited project-level data available as well, right? So this is just a very high-level snapshot of the country level, an incomplete publicly available time series. So I actually had some other things there. Since there's no econometricians in the room, I won't bore you. But because of limited data, we couldn't actually estimate those models, which means I couldn't tease out causal relationships. Grad student, we got to talk after. Deep dive in Indonesia, so this is something I do want to explore a little bit more, and then also doing a trade flow model. So I've completely hand-waved at that last question on trade flow, but there is, at least looking at the data qualitatively, there's some evidence suggesting that ODA probably has a larger impact on trade flows than foreign direct investment. All right, next slide. All right, so that's RTI, that's my home. Employer, also home. Snag my email address there, and if you want to talk about ice cream or research, come talk to me after. Thanks.
Thanks, Justin. I want to talk about ice cream, but I also want to talk about trade flows. So we might have to do that. So next up, we have Natalia, and Natalia is a senior consultant at Alinea International, where she advises on development investments such as the Australia PNG Partnership and the Australian Infrastructure Financing Facility for the Pacific. Previously, Natalia worked as a strategic advisor with the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, where she directed Australia's International Gender Equality Team and managed aid and development projects for the Behavioural Economics Team at the Australian Government. Natalia also represented Australia in the multilateral negotiations at a number of opportunities and the UN General Assembly. Over to you, Natalia.
Hello. Excellent. Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Natalia Beghin, and I'm a senior consultant with Alinea International, where I specialise in development economics. As Erin just said, I've had a career that's focused in one way or another on infrastructure financing. First as a negotiator for the G20 Infrastructure Investment Principles, later as a strategic advisor to the AIFFP, and most recently as a designer for Australia's largest ODA bilateral infrastructure program in PNG. Can I have a slide change, please? Thank you. But across all of these roles, I've had this one question that's been niggling at me the whole time, which is why is developing market infrastructure borrowing so expensive, and is this cost actually justified? My talk today, which is about the consistent overpricing of credit risk for infrastructure borrowing in low-income economies, is going to have a stab at the answer. Thanks. To do so, I'm going to talk you through the infrastructure financing gap, chat through some empirical evidence about why and how that overpricing is taking place, and also suggest a few solutions that ODA can offer at both the project and the systems levels to fix those distortions that's creating all of that overpricing. But maybe a little bit of quick housekeeping before we begin. All of my empirical number crunching has been focused on evidence and data that's coming from two big databases. One is called the Global Emerging Markets Database, or GEMS Consortium, and the other one is the World Bank PPIAF database. So these are open source. They all quote figures in US dollars, as I will today, and you can follow along at home if you'd like, using the links on the screen. Cool. So, look, we're all familiar with the infrastructure financing gap, but I think it's worth setting out the scale of what's at stake before we get into some more detail. Just to recap the numbers, the World Bank estimates that developing economies need to spend 4.5% of their GDP every year just to maintain essential infrastructure and keep basic services running. So that's equivalent to about $1.5 trillion a year just to keep the lights on. But in practice, developing economies are investing closer to 3.5% of their GDP, and that's leaving an annual financing gap of roughly $400 billion. So without more financing, the infrastructure gap in these economies is going to grow and compound, and we're looking at a total financing gap of minimum $6 trillion by 2040. So to put that figure in perspective, last year, OECD DAC member spending on all ODA total was $212 billion. As another interesting comparison, OpenAI's most recent market valuation in October of this year was an eye-watering $500 billion. So we're still talking a long way to go with ODA. And we also know that mobilising this amount of investment every year is really challenging, right? Even for developed economies, let alone least developed states that have a lot of trouble keeping their infrastructure financing in line with their capital markets, which are very thin and which are lagging behind population growth. And this matters particularly acutely in the Pacific where, as we've all heard over the last few days, aid financing is falling, debt burdens are rising, and infrastructure needs are outpacing what governments can borrow sustainably. If the risk that I'm conjecturing is being overpriced it continues to be overpriced, what's going to happen is that these countries are going to remain structurally dependent on high-cost commercial loans, which is something that Australia has a very clear interest in mitigating. But what's also strangely clear is that there's no structural shortage of available capital for infrastructure finance. Just last year, institutional investors were sitting on $2.5 trillion of something that's called dry powder, which basically means a whole lot of money that they've committed to expend but haven't yet spent. And of that, $400 billion was earmarked for infrastructure, which is uncannily exactly the same size of the annual gap that I was just describing. So if the capital exists but isn't flowing, the question becomes why. As I've already suggested, my proposition is that the credit risk for infrastructure borrowing has been overpriced and consistently overestimated. Thank you. So the GEMS database that I mentioned earlier, this aggregates credit exposures across all developing market economies for the last 30 years. That's more than 10,000 credit exposures. If you crunch all of those numbers over that time, what you see for private lending is an average default rate of only 3.54% and a recovery rate of nearly 73%. So that means that even on the very, very rare, in the very rare circumstances in which those debtors did default, 3/4 of all of lost capital was recouped, either through whether that be like restructuring or just biding their time. So the losses were not particularly high. When you look at public lending, which is there up on the screen, you see an even stronger and more interesting story. The creditors in these cases over the last 30 years experienced only a 2.61 percentage point default rate and an 85.8% recovery rate over the same period. Thanks. Now, I know that's a lot of fast stats for a Friday morning, but bear with me because it's pretty amazing to see that when you do crunch all of those numbers a little bit further, what that yields is an average principal loss rate for private lending of less than 1%, 0.96%, and the same for public, even smaller, at only 0.37%. That is equivalent to credit, like investment grade credit in advanced economies, something like a BBB or an A rating for any Moody's fans in the audience. And it also doesn't take into account the fact that default rates have been falling over time. And if you zoom in to infrastructure specific lending, the picture is even better. So between 1983 and 2018, African economies had the lowest default rate of any region in the world at just 1.9%, as compared with Northern America at 6.6% and Western Europe at 4.6%. World Bank PPIF data, which I mentioned before, also confirms that expected losses from emerging market infrastructure have averaged about 0.5% over the same period. But despite this evidence, developing economies are still being charged risk premia routinely exceeding 10%, which is clearly far higher than the real losses would justify. So put another way, what we're seeing is that well-structured infrastructure investments in developing economies behave like investment-grade credit, but they're priced like distressed debt. Before we go on, I think it's important here to distinguish between credit risk and project risk and the confusion between the two, which is likely to be driving a significant portion of the mispricing. So in most emerging market infrastructure deals, project-specific risks, and by that I mean things like technical and contractual and regulatory risks, are relatively well managed, and particularly so when multilateral development banks or development financial institutions come to the table. But pricing is rarely determined at that project level. Instead, it's benchmarked against something called the sovereign's Eurobond spread, which is basically a fancy way of saying the rate at which any country can borrow in a foreign currency. These rates, the Eurobond rates, already incorporate macroeconomic volatility and liquidity concerns, whether that be things like currency depreciation or political instability, and this leads to a distortion in the pricing at the project level. Once again, I think these kinds of settings demonstrate we're not talking about a shortage of capital here, we're talking about an inability or an inefficiency in the market to read and respond to the data correctly. Thanks. I reckon there's three main reasons why this is happening. One is information asymmetry. So default and recovery data, like the stuff that I just showed you, like GEMS, isn't frequently incorporated into credit rating agencies' own databases. And so what that means is that these private credit models are relying instead on that sovereign credit rating standard that I was just talking about, which are retrospective and aggregate risk across entire economies. They're also treating multilateral development bank supported loans as outliers, even though, as we've just seen from the GEMS database, there's a heap of data suggesting that the private lending default rates and recovery rates are performing more or less just as well as the public. Another factor is liquidity. Because low-income country infrastructure debt is perceived to be super risky, it means it's really hard to sell on in secondary markets. And so what that means is investors demand an extra yield to buffer themselves against any potential inability to sell on that debt, and that increases the price. And the last factors are currency and regulatory distortions. So projects in local currency, kind of like the illiquidity concerns, attract an often implicit risk premium to cover things like convertibility and transfer risks for currency. But on top of that, credit rating agencies apply something called the sovereign ceiling rule, which means that no infrastructure project can have a credit rating that is higher than that of the host country in which it's being hosted. So even though it might have really strong guarantees, whether that be through being backed by a development finance institution or otherwise being de-risked because it's got a really great commercial viability, it cannot be rated higher. So if you put these factors together, they stack up and they add a whole lot of basis points to the risk premium, and the prices stack up fast. In practice, what that means is that a project with a real risk of any loss of principal at less than 1% is still going to be charged more than 10% to borrow, which is orders of magnitude higher than the data suggests is reasonable. And all of that difference, or the great majority of that difference, doesn't have anything to do with the real credit risk that's there. So this means we next need to ask ourselves what can be done. Investor behaviour in the green, the blue, the peace and the sustainability-linked bond markets, I reckon, gives us some clues about what might be possible. And it's because these instruments show that investors' sense of risk is surprisingly elastic, not because they suddenly get more adventurous, but because good data that's available with these instruments lowers uncertainty. And when outcomes are monitored and verified, risk pricing becomes easier. So One great example is sovereign sustainability-linked bonds. In 2022, Uruguay released the first of these, which had payments tied to things like emissions reduction and national forest coverage targets. And this instrument was oversubscribed 7-fold, which shows that you can still hardwire sustainability into bond performance and attract really high investor interest from the private sector. Likewise, a year later, Fiji released its own blue bond. This was a little smaller, but had the same amount of oversubscription from the private sector, which was all the more interesting, I think, because of Fiji's kind of relative thin capital market. Put together, these examples and many others, which we unfortunately don't have time to explore today, underlie a consistent pattern. What you're looking at is speculative assets that are backed by credible frameworks and independent verification of outcomes. And what's happening is that investors are showing up even in developing market economies. The same trend is holding true for infrastructure markets. If you look more closely at that PPIF data that I was talking about earlier, what you'll find is that infrastructure investments tagged as green have defaulted at less than half the rate of ones that have not been tagged as green over the last 10 years. So their average default rate has been less than 2.5% as compared to a 5.2% overall default rate. What this also indicates is that when social and economic impact is measured, real and perceived risks for those investments fall. And it also underlies that credible data can correct that systematic overpricing. I also want to hover on a particularly interesting point, which I think we can often glean over when we're talking about this stuff. It means that markets aren't inherently biased against things like sustainability and inclusion, things that we as development practitioners care about. What they're biased against is uncertainty. And when that uncertainty is reduced through transparent, verifiable performance, risk prices move in line with the evidence. Thanks. So, to recap, we've seen that developing countries lose about 1% of borrowed principal to actual defaults, yet they can still pay orders of magnitude higher to borrow. These are costs that are driven far more by perception than performance. I think that there's a really strong case for using ODA to buy down this mispricing and redirect that financing in ways that can correct distortions in the market at both the project and the systems levels. Thanks, Finn. So there are a few practical ways to do this at the project level, but the most important in my view, and the one that I think is most important for donors like Australia, is to link their existing concessional finance to what I'm calling verified performance. So under this model, the borrowing cost of capital would change on the basis of the performance of an infrastructure investment. So say you've got a solar power plant in the Sols. If that power plant is meeting agreed and defined goals, things like inclusive employment, emissions reduction, and the like, a donor like Australia could lower the borrowing interest rate, whether by providing additional grant financing or itself acting as the donor through the EFA to lower that concessional rate. And if it wasn't achieving those outcomes, what the donor could do was hold that interest rate steady, or under very prescribed specific circumstances, perhaps even actually raise that interest rate. Future iterations of the AIFFP and the EFA CF window, I think, are really well placed to build in these performance-linked mechanisms. And DFAT's already got experience through PIDGE, which provides the kind of regulatory and operational backbone through which this could happen. So it is possible. It's just a matter of making the choice. Critically, my view is that as more projects were reporting against these clear and verified and measurable targets, the resulting data should work to reduce uncertainty and reward the performance in areas that are often undervalued, that kind of inclusion and climate piece that I was alluding to before, and allow future risk spreads in similar markets to be priced more on evidence rather than perception. To support this, I'd also be suggesting that donors like Australia take something called a first loss position, which means that in the event of a default, they would absorb, say, the first 10 to 20% of any loss, or something called a partial credit guarantee, which means that in the event that a default happens, they would also be kind of on the hook for paying parts of that loan back. It's basically a simple way to reduce the risk that private investors face, as my colleague was talking about earlier, and to give them greater confidence to lend at lower rates and for longer. Thanks. But ODA doesn't also need to fund every project directly, right? There are things that it can do at the systems level strategically to help markets themselves reprice or price accurately. So some systems options include using ODA as a calibration tool to improve the information systems that help markets price the risk. And that means supporting mechanisms like credit registries, standardized reporting, and independent evaluations. Another option is that it can provide the stability tools that keep essential projects safe from temporary shocks and stopping those shocks from turning into a default kind of down the line. So that means things like using ODA to support foreign exchange buffers and liquidity reserves, all of which remain ODA eligible under OECD DAC blended finance standards. And here's the thing, like nothing that I've been talking about right now, all of these suggestions, none of this is revolutionary. All of these things already exist in one way or another. The issue is more the kind of lack of creativity and the lack of scale and the lack of rapidity at which they are, applied, if ever. A first position loss for a donor that takes 8 or 9 years to negotiate isn't an innovative financing mechanism, it's an irrelevant one. Because by the time it's agreed, the opportunity that it was meant to back will have evaporated. I think putting together this presentation has made me reflect on, how sobering this is. These kinds of delays, these kinds of complications, they act as a kind of development tax that we as donors and practitioners are imposing on billions of people around the world every day. And they're also just another symptom of the mispricing that I've been talking with you about. Okay, let's try and pull some threads together. We've seen that developing economy infrastructure performs far better than markets assume. So what that means is that the financing gap for critical infrastructure isn't persisting because there isn't enough liquidity. And not because borrowers are defaulting at unsustainable rates. It's persisting because risk in these markets is being overpriced. We've also seen that concessional finance, or when concessional finance is rewarding independently verified outcomes, it can do its job to chip away at that information asymmetry and scarcity that's causing the markets to overprice that risk in the first place. Done well, I reckon that this has an opportunity to create a self-reinforcing and compounding cycle, which you can read yourself up on the screen there. And we already see a lot of evidence, right, for this in the sustainability and green-linked financing space. The challenge now is for us to systematically apply those learnings to the infrastructure market. What that's going to mean as a first step is applying the data, like the GEMS database, directly into private credit financing models, and also using the concessional tools, some of which I've just suggested, like that performance verified interest rate mechanisms, to address those distortions at both the project and the systems levels. But if there's one thing you take away from my talk today, I want it to be this. Even a small change will make a massive difference. If you make a 1% reduction in the average infrastructure interest rate the developing market economies are paying at the moment, that would free up hundreds of billions of dollars every year for those economies. And that's the equivalent of bringing many hundreds more investments and infrastructure opportunities to market that wouldn't have otherwise seen the light of day. Stepping back, I feel like the conclusion is really straightforward. The infrastructure financing gap isn't a financing failure, it's a signalling failure. And what's going to make the difference is not spending more, it's going to be spending more accurately, and it's all possible right now. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Natalia. I'm really excited about financing now, and I'm definitely not a finance person. Okay, we've probably got time for one question. Let's see how far we can go. Have we got another mic to go out to the floor, Finn? Yep, okay. The first hand I saw go up was right here at the front, so we might try and get that one first, and then we've got one or two at the back if we've got time. If you can keep it concise for me, that'd be great.
Yeah, thanks. My question is to Justin. So sorry, I am Sunil Bhatt. I am a partner at a global consulting firm, Microsave. We work across Asia as well as Africa. So one question and one observation. your inverted parabola graph shows at some point of time it takes an inverted thing. So how do donors like DFAT or anyone else for that matter know that it's going to change the direction? So is there anything around that? And the other observation is for the graphs which you showed, I saw that the R square was quite low. So I was just thinking, is FDI the only independent parameter or dependent parameter, or there could be many others as well?
Yeah, great question. So on the first, I don't want to speak on behalf of DFAT, so let's say donors writ large. I think donors could just do what we just did today. And we heard a little bit from the keynote yesterday of having more rigorous empirical analyses be just part of the norm, not waiting for academia to 2 or 3 years later after the fact evaluate something, but bake in that rigorous evaluation framework from the very beginning. And I think there's the whole goal of my presentation was to show that there's potentially some things we can actually look at. And ideally, if things are baked into programs, into their MEL, we don't have to rely on World Bank data that's going to be published a year or two after the fact. On the R squared, absolutely. It is a pretty complex relationship, and I'm only showing 2 potential explanatory variables of it. And considering that, it's relatively high, but that means there's a lot in the error term that's not being explained. So there's a lot going on that's impacting foreign direct investment that is outside of ODA and outside what might be captured in that corruptions perceptions index.
We've got one more up the back. Finn, if you could, and then I think we might have to wrap it up.
I'll make it super quick. Thank you for the really interesting presentations. My question's for Natalia. So why doesn't Australia have a DFI?
Hi, can you hear me? So there was a review done. I can't speak on behalf of the government, but if you are interested, there was a review into whether or not Australia should get a DFI some years ago, and the recommendation was against why doesn't it have a DFI. My opinion is that it should have a DFI, and that it could do a great deal with a DFI. But you know, if you consider that the AIFFP, for better or worse, functions essentially in one way or another like a DFI, it could also be making different choices, and those accord with some of the recommendations that I was giving during my speech. Those are all mechanisms, particularly, well, actually, regardless of whether you're talking project or systems levels, those are all mechanisms that the AIFFP could choose to implement right now based on the legislation and the mechanisms that are available to them. Certainly there'd be some kind of gear feeding and teething, but there is nothing stopping it from doing that. And so I think, you know, in very broad brushstrokes, the answer to why is tied up in questions about national interest. It's tied up in questions of kind of the instrumentalization of the ODA component of that funding and how and why it's being used, and different opinions about what the most strategic allocation of that funding is. Thanks.
If I can add one point on that. Okay. The Australian government is starting to, right? You mentioned PIDGE, which kind of operates as a part of what DFIs do. You mentioned, of course, AIFFP and ADI, which we haven't really talked a whole lot about. So Australia is kind of stepping into that direction, but I think as they should a little cautiously with some risk aversion.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, could you join me in thanking our excellent panel this afternoon?